Hey, everybody, it's not too late to say Happy New Year because this is the very first show of 2019 for Mike Farley and Bob Back as your genial and always informative and entertaining hosts of the Progress Report.
I agree wholeheartedly with that description.
We're getting into Trump world where we praise ourselves relentlessly. And we have a great guest tonight, one of our favorite people in the entire city of Manchester, John Clayton, the executive director of the Manchester Historic Association. And
As if that's all John Clayton
oh
is.
no, we'll provide more
There's
information.
so much more.
And he will provide more, but when we have John on, it's always an entertaining and show, and we usually have people who want to participate, and we hope you will this time too. And the number, of course, as you probably know, and we'll just remind you, is 640-3091. Love to have you call in when John's telling us some interesting things about the really fabulous history we have in this Queen City of New Hampshire, Manchester.
We've got more history in Manchester than we deserve. We really do. We've got the kind of history that a city like Philadelphia and Chicago has. You know?
Envy, right? I can hear those people in those cities fighting back on
Oh,
that.
scoff as they might, I defy them to prove otherwise.
But we have a wonderful tradition going here in the show. It's not always every week, but when it is, it's always a real pleasure to have it. And it's Mike Farley's ingenious idea of having frequently, but not always, as I say,
We're backing
something
away a
we
little
call
bit.
the POTUS Report on the Progress Report. And he tells me he's got one for tonight.
Yeah, a very brief one, Bob, and it kind of goes along. I don't know if you know, my name is Michael. My middle name is John, and that's kind of the theme of this POTUS report this week. I've heard reports. I can't say that I've seen it on TV myself, but I've heard reports that in conversation in the White House, President Trump frequently misstates the name of John Bolton, his security advisor, calling him Mike instead. Now it's also John.
By the way, doesn't the J in Donald J. Trump stand for John?
I was just going to say yes.
I thought so.
John. It's also Trump's middle name, so it should be relatively easy to remember. But apparently he's got John Bolton. You know, the guy with the big white walrus mustache that was down in Florida during the recount in 2000.
Yeah.
That John Bolton, the
guy who
the
became
war hawk.
He became the ambassador to the United Nations.
Indeed.
After he said that the top 10 stories of the building should be lopped off because it was useless.
That's the guy.
That's
the guy. I wish we had a picture we could put it up. But there is a Michael Bolton. You may recall.
Yes.
He was a soft rock singer in the 1990s.
Yes,
he had
right.
long curly hair. And apparently Trump may be stuck in the 90s. I don't know what it is. And again, I got to say, I haven't seen him do it. But keep your eyes peeled. If you hear him referring to John Bolton as Mike, he's apparently got him confused with the soft rock singer, Michael Bolton. And that's this week's Progress Report.
Okay.
Not too serious, not too earth-shattering, no real news.
I give that one a B+.
Well, you know,
you had an A+.
I've had some
time.
good ones, and it's hard to always be coming with my A game.
It was
which
good.
is why I'm kind of backing
Not the
off
best
on
you've
that
ever done, but it was
every
good.
week thing.
Okay. So there you are. There's tonight's POTUS report and the Progress report. We may try and keep them coming. I hope we do because I certainly enjoy them.
That one went over like a lead balloon. So if I don't have you rolling in the aisles, Bob, it's not satisfactory. So I'll have to work harder.
Just to remind you, and maybe John wasn't watching the show last time, he riffed on the fact that the Trump Foundation has been ordered dissolved, and he's unfit to administer any charity in New York. But somehow he
couldn't be on the board of the Staten Island Little League.
He couldn't be on the board of the Staten Island Little League, but he can be president of the United States. I thought that was a real.
Well, you know, all right, roll out the old one. Since today's one wasn't that good, roll out the old one. We'll try to get a few more laughs out of it.
Okay. Anyhow, we are so pleased.
Let's get someone else talk.
We are so pleased to welcome back John Clayton. John has been 3.5 years fulfilling the job for which his life prepared him better than anybody could have imagined. The executive director of the Manchester Historic Association, which runs our wonderful Millyard Museum, and the facility with all the records up there on Amherst Street, and is just a treasure for this city with its fabulous history. And nobody knows that history better than John Clayton. He is the author of 7 books about the history of Manchester, and also was for I can't believe this. He just told me 27 years he wrote a column for the Union Leader, frequently reflecting on life in the city and its history.
It got to the point where that was the only column I would read. But I'd look for it.
Well, there's a lot of ex-Union Leader employees around doing other
A
things.
lot of them.
A
Holy
lot of
cow,
them.
there's a lot of them.
There's
yeah.
one named Tom Faze, now a lobbyist in Concord, doing a great job for the Banking Association. But anyhow, we digress. John Clayton, we're really glad you could come down and join us. And I did have the privilege of attending the what Chris Pappas did, which I thought was an excellent idea and a great event. To have his swearing in the nation's capital, which they all do, and then come back to his hometown and his alma mater, Central High School, and have a swearing in their last ceremony. And voila, who shows up as the master of ceremonies? John Clayton.
The obvious choice.
He has a little experience in that.
Who else could it be?
And
how do you say no to Chris Pappas?
How do you say no to Chris Pappas? Yeah, and
by the way, I think that was a really inspiring thing to do, to go back to your high school, especially Central High School, given what we're dealing with here in Manchester, and every one of those kids can look up on that stage and say that could be me any day.
And there were a lot of kids in the ceremony. Bob, as mentioned, he was there. It was an auditorium on the 4th floor of the Classical Building, which is not often used. It's nowhere near the size of the McAllister Auditorium in the Practical Arts Building, but it had a substantial floor space, and it was packed. And I was thrilled to see so many students there from Central High School who took it upon themselves to go. Some of my friends, my wife, in fact, was unable to attend because we couldn't get her in the building. The fire department actually had to weigh in.
Well, we were lucky to get there. I almost backed out, and I know some people did, because they said, "Oh my God, here's this line that's going to be standing room. Can we even get in the building?" But those who hung out and stuck it out and did get in, they had a wonderful event to attend, and you were a big part of it. So,
well, thank you.
Talk to us about that, and you closed the ceremony. You opened, of course, but you also closed with I think, a fascinating little history of the first congressional district, which I thought was so appropriate and so interesting.
Well, I thought it was important that people come to understand, the path in which Chris Pappas is walking now, because it's been trod by many, many people before him. The first congressional district of New Hampshire wasn't founded until 1847, and I thought people were surprised to hear that, having our revolution occurring, a good 60 years before that.
Right.
But in fact, it was 1847. It was called an at-large district, and the first person elected to fill the seat was a gentleman from Exeter named Amos Tuck. Now, you hear that name, Tuck, and it kind of resonates in some ways. He was a Republican, but his name is what is carried now on the Dartmouth College Amos Tuck School of Business.
Right.
He was a Dartmouth graduate, and his son, who benefited mightily from his father's largesse, created the college that would bear his father's name. And, it was a largely Democratic gathering. Am I safe in saying that?
You are.
Chris being a Democrat, and obviously a lot of his supporters are. So I pointed out that, Mr. Tuck was also generally recognized as the founder of the Republican Party. But given that crowd and given my wry sense of humor, I pointed out that, in the spirit of bipartisanship, we forgive him on this day, because having a room full of Democrats talking about the guy from New Hampshire who founded the Republican Party. So
But that's a whole nother
that
story.
was well received, I must say.
Don't some
deep
people
roots
claim
of
that
the
the
Republican.
actual National Republican Party was actually formed in New Hampshire?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a claim for, someplace in Wisconsin. I think.
Moline, yeah, Wisconsin.
But
very good.
we have a claim here, don't we?
Yeah, and it's Amos Tuck is the real claim.
He's the claim.
Yeah,
huh?
and he was a confidant of Abraham Lincoln, and given the slavery movement that was still in place, the Republican Party was going to be the party of reform on that issue. So Amos Tuck played a really strong role in that foundation.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
Oh, good.
But I'm gonna.
Here it comes.
And if the answer is I don't know, that's fine. But what came before? During, I mean, the current constitutional arrangement occurred well before that. And we did go through the Articles of Incorporation and all this,
Yep.
or Confederation. But what came before, as far as the Congress? How did we get congressmen if the district itself?
I've got a guess on this, but
Yeah, when we were operating out of Philadelphia, as you know, the Continental Congress had begun there, and then the capital was moved to New York, and there was all this discord among the different elements of government in terms of how that representative government would take shape. But I'll defer to Bob if he thinks he has the proper answer on
well,
it.
I'm going to take a guess, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong. I figure that probably at that time our population was so much smaller that we only had one congressman. And it was about that time we
From each state.
ranked. You don't have to have two. Is that basically it?
I would think that that would be the case because, again, being an at-large district, it meant we just need another from New Hampshire, and the district hadn't been carved out to the geography that we know today, which has changed several times because of
So
gerrymandering.
actually, what you talk about the history of the first district was not really the first district. We had two congressmen that ran it both at large
At large.
for the entire state.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Amos,
okay.
Amos Tuck was number one, and he was a Republican, as we talked about. The first Democrat elected to the seat was a gentleman named George Kittredge, and it was fascinating because he, like Chris, was a graduate of Harvard University, and he started his political career at the New Hampshire House of Representatives, as did Chris. So it was interesting parallels there, going back 150 years, and still there.
Well, my
Yeah.
goodness.
Now, the first know-nothing candidate was a gentleman named James Pike, who was elected in 1855, and that was a time when here in Manchester we had a know-nothing mayor as well. His name was Thomas Abbott, and he was elected on the Know-Nothing Party, which we can say today was founded on discrimination against Catholic and Irish citizens.
And we're right in the middle of the Great Hunger in 1855.
Exactly.
We're starting to see
They're
the
coming in
flow of
waves.
Irish coming
So
in.
this is one of the first parties that was really anti-immigrant, particularly against Irish.
Exactly. And so I pointed out to everybody in the audience that, the Know Nothing Party, is there a more accurate description of a political party than the Know Nothing Party, which was based on race and bigotry? And so I got a pretty good laugh, and in which I pointed out to all my Irish friends in the crowd, just ask Sheila O'Neill Smith or Kathy Sullivan or Molly Kelly, who was in the Senator Molly Kelly joined us, and my friend Bob Mongan, and it was pretty funny because I actually could have kept naming Irish people in the audience to talk about the Know Nothings.
I'm going to take this opportunity, since we're talking about the know-nothings in response to the Irish coming specifically to Manchester. There's a passage in one of your books where you note that the good citizens of Manchester decided to welcome them with sticks and rocks.
Yes.
However, the Irish, having centuries of experience with the great game of hurling, were better at sticks and rocks, and therefore were allowed to stay. And it's a great passage, and I just thought I'd bring that up since it kind of, I think, fits with where we're talking right here.
Keep my books relevant. Thank you, Michael. That's important. Another well-known first district CD was Frank Jones from Portsmouth, who was very active in the railroad industry and the hotel industry. It was he who rebuilt what we know today as Wentworth by the Sea Hotel. But my point to Chris was that his greatest claim to fame was the Frank Jones Brewery. Frank Jones was one of the
You mean
leading...
the most recent rebuilding of the hotel?
No, 100 years ago.
The original
okay,
It's gone
okay.
through several, yeah. But
Okay.
he's the one who saved it from demolition. So we had the skeleton to work from. But Frank Jones, again, was a well-known brewer and was one of the leading producers of ale in the United States. So I pointed out to Chris that you're going to have to go a long way to top Frank Jones as my favorite representative of the 1st Congressional District. You serve mudslides. You may be-
Chicken tenders don't count for nothing.
I know that Chris got a kick out of that because it was something he didn't see coming.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden it was that little misdirection humor. You get him going the other way. And because Mayor Joyce Craig had joined us on the stage to swear in Chris, with the formal oath of office, I pointed out to her that the first Manchester native to be elected to the first CD was Mayor Eugene Reed, a mayor of Manchester who was a native of the city. And nobody knew, but Mayor Reed and his brother were among the finest rifle marksmen in the country. And when Buffalo Bill Cody brought the Wild West Circus here to Manchester, Mayor Reed actually took part in a shooting exhibition with Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley, the world-famed female.
Right here in Manchester.
Fantastic.
Right here in Manchester. And so as I'm explaining that to the crowd, and I know Joyce is listening with both ears, I pointed out that he also presided over the shortest series of aldermanic meetings in Manchester history. I wonder if you can figure out how these two things come together. Coincidence? I think not. I looked over and Joyce was doubled over laughing, thinking, maybe there's something to this. There's a method to this madness. So it was great. Chester Merrow served 20 consecutive years.
I actually remember him.
Yeah, from
He was from
43
up
to
in Ossipee.
63. Yep. And
There seems to be a pattern. We also had a mayor in Manchester that served almost that same period of time, Joseph
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 F.
F.
Benoit.
Benoit.
Yes, absolutely. And so, there was stability
people
in
were
elective
happy.
offices.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially, with the turmoil around the war. Once the war ended, I think people enjoyed that stability. And so, first, do no harm. It's almost like you're a doctor when you're a congressman. Don't mess it up. Don't call attention to New Hampshire. Just, bring the money home when you can. And Chester Merrow, again, was very successful. I'd like to tell you that 20 years from now, we'll be celebrating Chris having broken that record, but my guess is he has higher ambitions.
I would think he might. He's moved up with great distinction in every post he served in, starting with the House and county treasurer and Hillsborough County treasurer, and then I think he went from there to the executive council
Yep.
and served, was it 3 or 4 terms? I can't remember.
I think
but
3. I was at the
3.
Hospital Association when he first ran,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
he came to see us
Yeah.
to learn the ropes, what's
Yeah.
going on, and what's this very technical industry all about.
Yeah. Well, it was just a wonderful, wonderful event, and the music was sensational, from the Gay Men's Chorus to the Central High brass
The
players.
brass band came back and played at the
Played
end.
and then with a singer. It was just great, and you were proud to tell us, and very rightly so, that when you were on the stage as the MC, and Joyce was there, and Chris was there, we had graduates of Central, and Chris, you're a proud graduate of Manchester West,
Yes.
and Joyce, a very proud alumna of
Memorial
Memorial
High
High
School.
School.
Most fortunate of
And
the
I-
3, I would say.
Yeah.
And I thought that was great. And I spoke at Manchester Rotary on Monday, and my friend Mark Burns said nobody from Bradley was there. And I said, they chose not to make themselves known if they were there. So I'll let you deal with the ramifications of that. But I just thought it was a great tribute to the Manchester public school system that, 3 graduates, random chance, happened to be there representing our 3 schools with such great pride.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things I realized, during the program that
You know what else
this is
it's-
special.
You know what else it says about the city? You guys stuck around.
Yes.
Manchester is strong enough to retain that kind of talent pool. That's very important.
I just want to say one more thing about Chris. I was so pleased that he took the time to call out by name 3 of his teachers that had really been important to him at Central High School. I thought that was really, really nice. And there were a lot of the teachers there that were long-term teachers.
Yep.
Well, we're being told
Time
by
for a quick
Brian
break.
it's time for our break. It's always fun to have John here with us. And
What happened?
we'll come back and talk about other subjects pertaining to our history, a recently concluded exhibit, and John's got some good stories about that, about the role of Manchester in World War I. I hope you had a chance to see it, because it's now gone, but there will be ways to experience it that he can explain. And we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back. And please join us. We hope to hear from you.
640-3091.
That's it. Got it right. Take care. We'll be right back. Okay, everybody, this is the Progress Report, the very first show for the new year 2019. Happy New Year, everybody. I think it's not too late to still say that.
Year of the Pig coming up.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We finally got through the 12 days of we must by now, huh? We had this
Oh,
interesting.
God, you're asking me to do math.
Yeah, the Christmas.
I don't know.
is
I hope
really
not,
Christmas.
because my
12
wife and
days.
I had a deal, and I still owe her a few gifts. So
I thought it was tied to the Advent calendar, but
Yeah.
don't hold me to that either.
Anyway, and if you're just joining us, we have, and we're very pleased to have John Clayton with us. He's been our guest before, but it's been quite a while. And I think everybody knows who John is. Most people actually know him. He's the executive director of the Manchester Historic Association, which is doing just great things. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was an exhibit which unfortunately closed on Saturday.
Yes.
It was a wonderful exhibit. It was about the role of Manchester in World War I, which ended 100 years ago in November, 11th month, 11th hour of the 11th day, and gave rise to Armistice Day, which is morphed into Veterans Day. But for a long time, it was Armistice Day as the most dreadful war we'd ever experienced in the Western civilization. Drew
up
to
to
a-
the time.
up to that time, drew to a rather disastrous close with the Treaty of Versailles, which one book described as the peace treaty to end all peace, which kind of is what happened.
Yeah.
This war really had an impact in Manchester, and the legacy of that impact continues today. And John, take it from there.
Sure. If you just look around at some of the institutions that we cherish in our community, Henry J. Sweeney Post. Henry J. Sweeney was a 20-year-old soldier who was killed in the Argonne Forest. He had married 6 weeks before he left, and when word of his death reached Manchester, Sweeney Post is Sweeney Post number 2. When it was time to apply for American Legion membership, Booma Post actually got the application in before Sweeney.
I've heard a different story.
That's my story.
The folklore is you're talking the Laconia Post and the Sweeney Post. They're both of their applications for the newly formed American Legion after World War I were dated the same day and was decided by a flip of a coin.
Right.
And therefore the Laconia Post got number 1.
No kidding.
So Henry J. Sweeney, again, is recognized on that post, but also on the west side of Manchester, Henry J. Sweeney Park. Originally that was known as Walker Park, but when word of Henry Sweeney's death arrived in Manchester, an aldermanic committee went to the mayor and asked that they possibly rename the park in his honor. It was a unanimous vote that was done that day, and so within weeks, Sweeney Park, as it stands today, was named in honor of
And
Henry
that was
Sweeney.
his old neighborhood,
Exactly.
which is why
West
that
Side,
park was
yeah,
selected.
West Side kid. But also, I'm a graduate of Goslar Park School. Henry Goslar was killed also in the Argonne Forest in April of 1918. Kalivas Park, the members of the Greek community, when Christos Kalivas died, they wanted to commemorate their first loss in that Great War. So these institutions are all around us, and
And most people don't know what these names stand for.
Exactly. Granite Square is also known as Herman Little Square. There's a plaque right there, a bronze plaque right in front of the Father Burns high-rise that makes it known that he too was a sacrifice in the Great War. So all these names are around us, and so it was a teaching opportunity for us. And this has been a hobby of mine for a long time, working with Mike Lopez and the late Tony Karam and John Mongan to make people aware of what all these markers and squares are around the city. So some years ago, when I was still at the paper, we did a book called Manchester's Honored Veterans, and included in that book are 13 different monument markers to World War I veterans who are remembered here in the city. So it
There are
surrounds us.
13 of them still
13
standing?
markers still standing, yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And again, that was the purpose for the book. And when we printed it, we made sure every elementary and high school got a copy to put in their library. But we only printed 1,000, and it's been 20 years. And so I have a cherished copy of my own in the
Yeah,
office
I should think
that I
so.
refer to. So when reporters would ask about me to explain why the war is still present in the community, I was able to share with them all those different markers and monuments and drive them around and show them. So.
Was Henry Sweeney the first Manchester soldier to be killed in action over there?
There's a back and forth, and that the short answer is yes. But for example, Lieutenant William Jutras, who has a Legion post on the west side
Yes.
that bears his name, argument over he was the first or second Franco-American to die. He was the first to receive this Distinguished Service Cross from Manchester, which is the second highest honor after what we know today as the Congressional Medal of Honor. So all of these men, and they were men at that time, it was amazing. And when they died, they were buried in France, and it took 3 years in many cases for the bodies to be repatriated and brought home. So in the case of Henry Sweeney, it was June of 1921, when they had a double funeral procession through Granite Square, and they were buried at St. Joseph Cemetery across the Bedford line. So those memories are gone simply because the people who experienced that loss are gone as well. So that's why we were so fortunate that the Legion posts in Manchester all supported the exhibit. They made donations, the DAV, the VFWs. That enabled us to make the exhibit even better by buying more mannequins, more displays, and we're incredibly grateful to those folks. But who better to help us tell the story than the institutions in town that commemorate the service of veterans?
There's another interesting location in the city of Manchester related to World War I, and I'd like you to enlighten us on that. And I'm not going to try to remember exactly what it's called, but it's on that little dead end at the end of Reed Street,
Oh, yes.
the railroad car.
Yeah, actually,
And-
that's from World War II.
Is it?
Many people, it's
Oh,
part of the tradition of World War I. They were called 40 and 8 men,
Yeah, the
men and
40
horses.
and 8, yeah.
And it was before the Great War. Those were the cable rail cars that carried them to the front. And it was said that they could accommodate 8 horses or 48 men or 40 men. And there was an American sergeant who first said to his commanding officer, I got the 8 horses in there. If you think of getting 40 men in there, you're crazy. Thinking it was both 40 men and 8 horses.
Well, so that was a World War II, because I know it says it's the 40 and 8. I thought
Yeah.
that was a World War I commemoration.
Actually, everything good comes from newspaper columnists. I truly believe that. But after World War II, Drew Pearson was a national newspaper columnist in Washington. And the losses in France were so great in terms of the hunger that was pervading after the war, in spite of the Marshall Plan. So Drew Pearson wrote a column encouraging Americans to donate things, food in particular, that would be shipped to France. And this incredible shipment, the love shipment went over there. And as a thank you to the American people, the French government got together and created the 40 and 8 Mercy boxcar, the thank you boxcar. And they filled each of 48 cars with all kinds of artifacts from the local small communities, trophies and plaques and all kinds of memorabilia. And each state got one of those cars after the war. We have a great photograph in the museum of the car on Elm Street in front of City Hall when it was being received by the people of New Hampshire. And I would venture to say there may be 2 left in the country.
Really?
And
out of the 48.
They've
there's
been
just two.
lost to fire. They've been sold for
And
scrap.
ours is still pretty nicely displayed.
It's beautifully displayed because the men of the 40 and 8 in Manchester and the VFW 8214 on the west side committed themselves to preserve this. So they built a pavilion in which the car sits, protected from the elements, and it's most of the artifacts have been distributed throughout New Hampshire. They were given to libraries throughout the state, but the car itself is in pristine condition because of the efforts of the local 40 and 8 here in town. Don Still was who owns Still's lawn place on Mammoth
Mammoth
Road,
Road.
was a big part of that group to help preserve that. And yeah, we're lucky in that's one of ours. But it's a World War I car, but it was a remnant of World War II.
I appreciate the enlightenment. I will file that away. And,
Every October-
I know more now than I did when I walked in,
As
which is
a
a good
kid
thing.
growing up on the west side, we would make our way to Rock Rimmon Swimming Pool, and that was always a stop for us, just to stop and look
Yeah,
and
it's
admire
a
it.
fascinating
and,
thing to see, and I like to take people there and show them that because it's more unique than I thought it was actually.
Yes, yeah. Because again, other states simply didn't care for theirs
Yeah.
in the way that we did here in New Hampshire, which I would say it's not surprising. It's not surprising
The
because
way that
that's
we did here in
that's how we are.
Manchester. That's
Yeah.
a Manchester thing, too.
Yep, yep.
John, you mentioned Drew Pearson. Hey,
Not the football player from the Cowboys.
No, I remember Drew Pearson. I represented Drew Pearson in my very first case I ever helped try with Joe Millimet here in Manchester. He had written a column, which didn't go out under his name. It went out under his partner's name, Jack Anderson.
Yes.
And it appeared in the Concord Monitor, and it called a certain Manchester politician named Alphonse Roy.
Yes, I'm familiar with Mr. Roy.
And he had been, I don't know what he was. Was he sheriff or something? I can't remember.
He was a sheriff.
He was the sheriff. And the column, which Pearson had wrote, called him a former small-time bootlegger. Do you know this story?
I have a story about my father and Mr. Roy. When my
Well,
father
I
was a
was
Manchester police
brand
officer.
new, just back here from being overseas, and went to work for Joe Millimet. And Roy was represented by the legendary Stanley Brown, whose son is just retiring as a very fine
judge.
Superior Court judge. And Joe Millimet put me to work in this case. Now, we always figured the really defamatory part of this was the small town.
From a Manchester perspective, right?
But
who are you calling
Joe
small town?
Millimet had me climbing around all these 3-story flop houses in Manchester, interviewing these people who had been around during Prohibition. Did anybody get their hooch from Alphonse Roy? We never could come up with anybody. And so this case went, I mean, this is part of why I love our history. I got such a dose of our political history from this case. The practice of filing straw candidates. You
Yes.
know, if an Irishman was the favored candidate for the Democratic nomination, somebody'd file with a French name, And this it led to the creation of the Ballot Law Commission we have today. And this trial went on, and I made about 6 trips to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and the case ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And when I came in, and David Nixon could never forget this. He was Stanley Brown's partner at the time, and we were both Wesleyan guys. And I went to him and I said, "This case is going to the U.S. Supreme Court." And Nixon thought, "What the hell do you know?" Well, I was right, and he never forgot that. And I was all set to get down to the U.S. Supreme Court and argue that case. And Pearson died. And he had a son-in-law who was a big-time Washington lawyer, and he hired Edward Bennett Williams,
Not too bad.
a famous name in the
Former
in
owner
the
of the
law.
Washington Redskins.
Yeah, all of that, to argue the case in the U.S. Supreme Court. So my chance to argue that case in the U.S. and Joe Milliman was going to let me do it. He thought I was really good at appellate argument, and I say it about 4 of them are, in the New Hampshire Supreme Court, up and down on the issue with the insurance coverage, and all kinds of things. Well, I'll just finish the story by saying that as the case was getting ready to be heard in the U.S. Supreme Court, all of a sudden I sent a I don't know, probably in those days it was a letter, not even an email, or a phone call to Williams, and I said, don't forget to explain that this case had a special verdict, which meant that they just say fine for the plaintiff for so many dollars. It was $25,000, which wasn't even much money even in those days. And Stanley Brown must have wished he'd never said he'd take that case. But in any event, I said, don't forget in this case, the jury returned a special verdict. They made additional findings. And I got a call from Edward Bennett Williams, the only time I'd ever heard from him. He said, what's this about a special verdict? And I went, oh my God, this man's arguing this case in the U.S. Supreme Court, and he doesn't know what the verdict in the case was, and he's the biggest name lawyer you can think of in D.C. Anyway, you got me going on that story.
Well, I'm happy we did.
And I tell you, someday we
great
got
war story.
we got to have an exhibit on the Roy case. Roy versus the Concord Monitor was the way it was captioned, and the defendant at the counsel table was a guy named Langley, who was a longtime publisher of the Monitor. I don't remember. This is a long time ago, but what an introduction to the lore of New Hampshire political life.
And just time spent with Joe Millimet in and of itself.
Oh, he was
amazing.
Something. He was an amazing guy. He had some wonderful phrases, and he said, the older you get, the more you get to be like yourself. Dead right. And another one was, you're going to find out as you go along that laymen care a lot more about the law than lawyers do. Dead right. I take my wife as an example. She's so worried if I step on the curb, I'll be jaywalking, And I say, no, come on.
I'm a lawyer. I can do it.
Lawyers know that there's a lot of distance between the cup and the lip, and enforcing the laws and that sort of thing. But
yeah, so it was Drew Pearson who was the genius behind that. And again, it was a very magnanimous gesture to encourage American people to donate foodstuffs to the people of France who were still starving. So it was 1948 when that rail car finally arrived here in
I'm glad to
Manchester.
stand corrected because I want to get my story straight.
It's a World War I car.
At
so
least
you
I
can hang
had
your hat
that
on
part correct. And you're so kind to make sure.
Now
you bring
I
that
understand
up.
why Drew Pearson was so interested to come up into Manchester. I had to pick him up at the airport and drive him up to the office. And he obviously knew a lot about Manchester.
Oh, yeah.
And he looked at the Bridge Street Bridge that we used to have with the arches.
The old Notre Dame Bridge.
He said, "Oh, you've got a new bridge." I said, "Whoa."
Yeah, and
That's
that
the
was
new
built
one.
in 1936. So
Yeah.
so do the math around your career.
Yeah.
And the fact that he viewed it as a new bridge mean he'd been here
He'd
a
been
long
here
time
a
before.
long time. Yeah, it was just fascinating. Okay, well that's really interesting stuff.
So we're not going to hear about your dad and Sheriff Roy?
Well, my father was a rookie Manchester cop. My grandfather had been a Manchester police officer, and my dad was a legacy cop. Frank McGranahan, who was the police chief, was best friends with my grandfather. So my dad was this rookie cop, and he's walking a beat on the west side, rattling doorknobs. In fact, he went to Sconlin's, found the door unlocked, went inside, called Mr. Sconlin. Mr. Sconlin came to lock the doors and insisted my father take a 5-pound box of hot dogs. And my father's like, I can't. I'm on the beat. It's nighttime.
That's too bad because they're really good.
Well, one day, one evening, my father's on a Sunday. My father's walking down Coolidge Ave by the old Modern Theater, and there was a small grocery store, and he sees a guy coming out of the store with a bag. And my father knows it's Sunday night, you can't sell beer. And the guy looks at my father and said, "Yeah, it's beer. What are you going to do about it?" So he starts taunting my father. So my father goes over to the box, and all you had to do was turn the key. And the car's already coming, the wagon's coming. And the guy's giving my father all kinds of lip. My uncle's the sheriff, county sheriff, you can't touch me. So the wagon shows up, my father puts the guy in the car, obviously drunk. And my dad finishes his route, goes back to the station. And when he gets to the desk, he says to the desk sergeant, "I want the keys for my prisoner." He said, "He's gone." My father said, "What do you mean he's gone?" He said, "What you do out there is your business. What we do in here is my business." And there were some profanities in there. So my father looked at him, knowing that the guy was the nephew of the sheriff. My father took off his hat, took off his badge, put it on his gun, pushed it across the table, and walked away. He quit.
That was his last day as a
Because
police
he
officer.
knew that if that's how it was going to go, it was always going to go like that. And McGranahan called my father the next day and said, "Bob, come on back." And my father's like, nope, can you tell me it'll never happen again? And he said, nope. He said, then I'm not going back. And so I have my dad's badge at my home.
No kidding.
Yep, because
That's a
my granddad
terrific
knew-
story.
Yeah, and that was my father. He
Wow.
didn't compromise much right to the very end. And I wrote that
guess so.
story when we were having problems with police commissioners who were trying to interfere. You know, back in the late 80s during the prostitution problems in Manchester that were happening in the center city. And so I felt that it was time to make people understand what police officers on the street have to deal with in terms of the crimes on one side and the influence on the backside. And it's probably one of the best columns I ever wrote, just because it was a great story.
It certainly is.
Yeah, a man of principle.
I'm very happy that I pressed you to tell it, because that is an excellent story.
I'll send
and
you.
it-
I'll send you the full column.
It's
because you need
it's
the
it's
context.
a it's a
Really?
story that deserves remembering in these times as well. I think there's room for improvement where
Yeah.
we stand right now.
Next time you're in my office at the museum, I have a picture of my grandfather in his full uniform. He was raised at the Webster House. My grandfather was, because when my great-grandparents came here from Ireland by way of England, at 37, my great-grandfather died. My great-grandmother had to work. So the Webster House had just been opened by the Protestant doyens of the city. So in 1884, there were 23 kids there, and my grandfather was a 5-year-old who was among them. So
My goodness.
people ask me why I'm the president of the board of the Webster House.
That's
now
a
you
pretty
know.
good reason. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of our family legacy. How do I say no to that? So,
Wow. Wow. Well, fascinating stuff, isn't it? My goodness.
When John comes
it's
by,
not about
John
me.
comes by. It's
I
always
could
great.
sit at John Clayton's knee all day long. You know, it's there are so many stories, and I'm going to come back to it. It's because the city generates those kinds of stories. That's the greatness of this city. That you know, you hear so much negativity on everyone's lips in the newspapers, and that's just such a small part of what's really going on in this city. All you have to do is look behind the curtain a little bit.
People of character, people of courage,
Yeah,
people of
yeah.
goodwill make this place special. And I always tell people, it's like, sure, it's the Merrimack River and, you know, it's the Inmuskeg Falls and the Inmuskeg Mills. It's the people that make this a special place. And that's why to see Chris Pappas and Joyce Craig and John Clayton on the stage at that swearing in is kind of a testimony to people that we stayed here for a reason. You know, we can make this place better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was a time when I
There's
graduated
a
from high
lot
school.
of potential to do
Yeah,
that.
all my classmates wanted out of Manchester was themselves. And I said, I will not be that person. I'm going to go get your education, get the best education you can, but come back. We're going to need you. Make us better. So
Wow.
that's my
Okay.
message. Next time I do a commencement speech, it's the same I did at Manchester Community College, same I did at UNH Manchester. The message never changes. We need you. Just come back. Help
Yeah,
us,
we
help
do.
us be better.
But you're
We-
right.
we-
I remember.
We have to have that message, and and a lot of good things are happening too. A lot of good things are happening. Hey, it's time for another break.
Take another break. This show is rolling right along, folks.
Rolling
You
right
can help
along.
us out. You might have a question about Manchester history.
And, or maybe you've got a good story. It's hard to top John Clayton's stories. It really is. But if you've got a good story about
I'd like to see
your
someone
family's
try.
history in this city, we'd love to have you come in and give us a shot. Give us a shot at doing that. Try it out. So
you in a
we'll be right back with our final segment very soon. Well, folks, this is the final segment for this Progress Report edition, the very first one of the year 2019, and we couldn't have a better kickoff guest than John Clayton, the director of the Manchester Historic Association, more knowledgeable about the history of Manchester than anybody. Mike Farley may be in second place on that.
Oh no, there's a lot of.
But
dear God.
you're pretty good. And,
I'm working on it, but I got a ways to
I know
go.
you're out there, and I hope some of you will choose to call in and participate in this discussion, which I may be biased, but I happen to think is absolutely fascinating. We ended up talking about the World War I exhibit, which is now closed. But first of all, John, you've preserved that exhibit in a way that's going to be accessible, right?
Thank you, Robert. I was going to say that because I feel bad we're talking about something that people can't see anymore. It's like we're tormenting them on purpose. Like, see, you should have come to the museum.
And they should have.
We'll get you next time.
Well, get the next one, right?
But again, thanks to our friends at Manchester Public Television, we spent most of the day Monday capturing that exhibit on video. I did the open for the whole purpose behind the exhibit, and I did the close, the end of the exhibit. But our research director, Dan Peters, who is an Afghanistan decorated veteran Army, was the lead curator on the exhibit. And I want very much for my staff to have time in the spotlight. It's not about me. So we had Dan do the balance of the tour through the museum with Brendan McCormick from Manchester Community TV, videotaping it. So that will become available soon. They ask us to look over the videotapes and make sure we're happy with our presentations, our facts are straight, and then it will be broadcast on Channel 97 on Manchester Public TV, and they will break it up into vignettes and different portions of it to share with us. So we'll be sharing it on our social media. Just a link you click on. I shared a link with you just recently about the same thing. And so that's our way of preserving the exhibit. It's great for our members who are physically unable to come to the museum for one reason or another. We're completely handicapped accessible, but some people just can't make it. So this is our way of preserving this too, because it's a very ephemeral thing if you think about it. You know, the exhibit goes up and it's there for 3 or 4 months and then it's gone. It's like an ice sculpture in that way. But
All the pieces go back
they
to
go
where
back
they
into
came from,
storage,
yeah.
and yeah, we do that and save them until who knows when they might be seen again. It could be another 100 years before someone chooses to bring these exhibits back out. So again, Manchester Public Television allows us to capture that for perpetuity as well as for the masses who may not have been able to come recently. So look for that. We're excited about that.
John, you bring something up, Channel 97,
Yes.
which is another one on the family of channels of Manchester Public Television. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the historical channel,
Yes, it is.
it not, where you
Yep.
can go back and watch aldermanic meetings from the 70s with psychedelic shirts and stuff.
I
It's,
saw George H.W. Bush presidential rally not that long ago on
it's got
Channel
some
97.
really good archive
Yeah.
stuff that Manchester Public Television has been able to preserve and dig up and curate. So
And they
it's,
spent some time with me back in September, in which I basically did these small vignettes throughout the Millyard Museum. So I would do a minute with the John Stark statue looking over my shoulder, just giving people snippets of what the museum's about. And they've been using those as what we call bumpers in the TV business, which are between shows. Since we don't have commercials here, that's something of a transition from one program to another. They'll show 3 or 4 of those things, and I'll be talking about the manufacture of rifles during the Civil War. I mentioned General Stark. It could be filling in the canals during urban renewal. So that History Channel has been a huge forum for us, beneficial for us in our getting people engaged in Manchester history. So kind of a secret, not so much. At our Historic Preservation Awards in May, one of the 5 recipients will be Manchester Public Television for what they've done with that History Channel to help us preserve Manchester's history.
Wonderful. I think
So that's an
we're
exclusive.
breaking news
That's an
here
exclusive
on
on
the
the progress
report,
report.
as we always like to do. Thank you, John. Thank
The
you for
press
that.
release has not gone out yet, so
And during the break, I was asking you what we might not have covered, and you suggested that in talking about all these interesting things about the heroes from Manchester that died, and they're memorialized with,
parks and squares and yeah.
Legion posts and parks and squares and 13 plaques around the city. You also mentioned that the war had an enormous impact on the company that caused this town to exist as a city, Amoskeag, and maybe you'd like to talk about
Sure.
that.
The economic fortunes of the city were greatly affected by the Great War, which is before we knew to number them. Amoskeag was really in a faltering mode going from the 1800s into the 1900s, and they were being bested by Southern competition. When steam power was introduced into the textile industry, we lost our advantage. In the Northeast, it was all about powerful rivers, so we used water power to power our textile mills. But when you could generate power by burning coal, all of a sudden the southern mills were gaining a foothold ahead of us because the cotton was grown right in their backyard.
have to
You
transport
didn't have
it up on the
1,000-mile
railroad.
commute, exactly, Mike, to bring it up here to Manchester or the Northeast. So they had a built-in price advantage right there. Labor was cheaper because unionization was much stronger in the North than in the South. You've all seen Norma Ray, Sally Field's great film about textiles in the South. Their buildings were made of wood, not brick. So again, their costs were so low. So we were being consistently
have to heat in the
undersold.
winter.
Right, consistently undersold by these southern products. So as we get into 1900, 1910, Amoskeag should have been investing in new technologies to improve their productivity and eliminate that price differential between the South and the North. And then comes 1914. And all of a sudden, America's not in the war, but we're getting a foothold. So the orders start coming in from the federal government to produce uniforms for Union soldiers, shoes, which were being manufactured in Manchester, gauze for bandages. Chicopee Mill was a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. So they made gauze there. So this federal money is coming in to produce all these great products, and the workers are making money, and the stockholders are making money, and nobody's looking to say, what's next? Amoskeag was always incredibly adaptive in terms of how the market changed, they would change with it. Simply manufacturing rifles and steam locomotives and steam fire engines is indicative of their capability of adapting, but they were blinded by the money. And they saw the money coming in, and so the war ends in 1918, that federal money dries up. By 1922, the workers are told that your 48-hour work week is now 54 hours, and we're cutting your pay 20% at the same time. That was all part of the economic ruin from the money that was squandered coming in from the federal government. So that was the beginning of the end for Amoskeag. The first general strike lasted 9 months. More than $50 million in salaries and productivity was lost. And Amoskeag was like a wounded mammoth staggering around,
Right.
unable to fix itself by that
Lasted
point.
quite a bit longer, but always in a very, very degraded condition.
On the way down, yeah. So 1933, the second general strike. At that point, Amoskeag was crippled. They started closing plants. And on Christmas Eve in 1935 is when the company filed for bankruptcy protection. The intent was to reopen. They were in New York trying to seek new funding. But 3 months after that Christmas Eve declaration, March of 36, the greatest flood ever to come roaring down the Merrimack River, blasted the city in two. And every mill building on the face of the river was filled to the second story with water and mud and silt. So any hope they had of reopening was dashed by that. So, but again, the precipitating factor was the way the money was squandered from the Great War. And if they'd been wise with their money, which they had always been, they might have found a way to persevere. And so it was left to the citizens of Manchester to find a way to save Manchester from
Which
Manchester.
they did, which your museum excellently presents the great success of the leadership of the city coming together and not giving it up and finding another way. And now look at our Milliard and look at a thriving place that is.
Right, and fast forward to 1962 when urban renewal is being
I was going to
considered.
say, now look at our Milliard. We're lucky that we can.
The Arthur D. Little Company, their main recommendation in the urban renewal proposal was that the Milliard will never be of aesthetic benefit to the city and should be demolished in its entirety. That was the official recommendation. Fortunately, people like Tamara Haraven, the author of Amoskeag, and her
Yes.
husband Randolph Langenbach, and a young lady from New York, worked for the New York Times named Ada Louise Huxtable.
Yes, they're architectural writer.
Architectural writer, a Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote about the crime of herbicide that was being committed in Manchester,
Yeah.
New Hampshire. Why do we have artificial constructs that we prop up like Plymouth Plantation and Colonial Williamsburg, which don't exist any longer? And yet here in Manchester, we have the manifestation of the Industrial Revolution in America, and we're taking a wrecking ball to it. Her words were so powerful, and there was all of a sudden a preservation movement came to flower in Manchester. And as Michael said, how lucky are we? Can you imagine Manchester without the Milliard as its backbone?
Yeah, it makes our city so unique.
And I can't tell you how many people that I've brought up who've come in from out of state, and I've brought them just take a drive down Commercial Street. And at first it's like, boy, this is interesting. And then you keep going. Holy cow, look at all these mills, and then you keep going.
Yep.
And the reaction to people who've never seen anything like this is not just a Milliard. This is an extraordinary Milliard.
There's a spirit that still burns there. And I tell people if there is, we're the keeper of the flame at the Milliard Museum.
Yeah.
It's our job to maintain.
And I
that
think we
spirit.
didn't save everything that we should have, and I think, it would have been really
Well,
nice.
don't get me started on that.
All right. I won't.
Michael and I have had
I think filling in both those canals was not a good idea, and tearing down the railroad station was a crime.
and the Notre Dame Bridge was
And the Notre Dame Bridge, So we haven't been perfect, but we did save the thing that's the signature of our city, and it's
Well, there's a lot of
and
other
it's such a
things that we
beautiful
need to
thing. You know, when I come out at a certain time of day, usually in the late afternoon, and I come down, I live over in Goffstown Road, and I come down to the Amoskeag, and I look out, and the sun is hitting the low sun is hitting those buildings.
October sun.
I think there's no more beautiful skyline anywhere.
And that's why Riverstone is in Manchester. They were coming down from Concord looking for real estate. Where are we going to set up our shop? As they're driving down the Everett Turnpike, one of those October afternoons, about 3 to 4 o'clock, they look across, they look to the east, and what is that? It was a glow. And within 2 years, their entire operation was in the mill yard because of that vision that you talked about.
Yeah, it really is a spectacular, spectacular thing. Well, fascinating stuff, John. What's next for the? I know you're always thinking about the next thing, whether it's the next exhibit or
We are.
what you're going to do.
And
Tell us about what's coming up
yeah.
this year. And I know we're coming on another primary.
Yep. Well, it's, we tend to go heavy then light, have something, really serious, and then something a little more entertaining. So our next exhibit is going to be called Hats Off to Manchester. We have an incredible collection of historic hats in our collection. I mean, the hat from Parazos in the box with the sales slip and the tag from
that's
Parazos.
fantastic.
And we have hundreds and hundreds of these. And so our museum educator, Christy Ellsworth, is fine. We're going to do a war exhibit. Okay. Can we do something fun next time? So Christy prevailed. So we'll do a hat exhibit. But we're already being asked about resurrecting our presidential primary exhibit in some way. It was so phenomenally successful 3.5 years ago. It's coming around again. You may think it's not until February. The candidates are already starting to lay groundwork here. And we just think that exhibit was so important for them to understand, the candidates, to come to the museum and understand the significance, the seriousness of purpose that we bring to the primary here in New Hampshire, how devoted we are to the process and committed to making it, the best democratic exercise we can make it. And for them to see photographs of Eugene McCarthy walking down Elm Street with Professor Mike Farrell from St. A's on his elbow, or to see JFK and Jackie at Manchester Airport in 1960. It just imbues a sense of understanding among the candidates and their staff. And the national media loves it. We were on every network. Defy you to name a network, including the BBC. We were on all of them. So we know it's a great point of exposure for us at the museum, but it's such an important story that we feel compelled to tell it again. In a new and different way, we'll keep some of the staples, but there's so much more technology we can bring to bear now. The selfie became very important 3 years ago, and we had a wall of live selfies that we kept adding to so that it was a living exhibit. It never gets stale, and we'll find a new way to do that again.
Wow. By the way, folks, I may have a bit of a news flash here. It'll be in the papers tomorrow, I'm sure. But just before we came over here to be on this show, I got a call saying that Senator Elizabeth Warren is making her visit to Manchester. She'll be at the community college on Saturday at 1:30. And so if you're interested in meeting a clearly intending aspirant to be the President of the United States.
It's just an exploratory committee.
It's just an exploratory committee.
That will be a tough ticket.
But we've had...
Allow me to say in advance, that will be a tough
We've
ticket.
had Cory Booker here. We've had Congressman John Delaney, Congressman Ryan from Ohio. I can't think of his first name. I know there's plans for Mayor Garcetti from Los Angeles to come here soon, and so it's really happening, and we're going to be the center of the world's attention again. Although California is trying to kind of muscle us out a little bit with this bad idea of early voting, Mike.
I'm not going to comment on it till I've given the issue some thought.
As I said, early voting in the general, no problem.
I
Primary,
do defer to John's point that
Yep.
the New Hampshire primary is a unique circumstance. So
Yeah.
I
Okay.
have to chew on that a little bit more.
Yeah. By the way, folks, until I knew John was coming on, one of the things I was planning to talk about today, and there were several things I had, but I posted something on Facebook a while ago that I intended not to vote to legalize marijuana. And I got a tremendous amount of pushback on that, and I'd like to engage the folks watching this show on that issue and hear your thoughts on that, pro and con. I don't know how many of you were friends of mine on Facebook or saw my post, which was basically to forward an article on this in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. But I'd like to have that discussion with you folks, and maybe we'll get some of you to call in and tell me what an idiot I am, or maybe some people won't think I am. But that's something I want to do, and I think that next week we may have somebody with us of the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission. They weren't available tonight, but they I think may be available to be with us next time and talk about We talked a lot about the future of Manchester with John. These are the people that are helping plan in the past, I should say, with John. But we'll talk with these folks about their vision for the future of Manchester and the Manchester greater area. So I want to thank John for coming back. It's always a pleasure when you're here. It's always just such a treat.
Happy to be invited.
And we will do it again a lot, I hope, and really, really appreciate it. And thanks for the POTUS report.
Well, I'll do better next time.
Okay, folks.
Coming off of holidays.
Do a bad impression of When a Man Loves a Woman, Michael Bolton's #1 song, which was a ripoff of Percy Sledge, by the way.
Yes, Percy, a great line from the Percy Sledge. I have the album. There's from the Commitments, an old movie about an Irish R&B band. Yes. Check it out.
Okay, everybody.
See you next week.
See you next week.